I never believed in ghosts until I started working the graveyard shift at the Millennium Tower in downtown Chicago. It was October 15th, 2023, when my world was turned upside down by what I discovered on the Red Line subway. Let me tell you, when you're riding public transportation at 2 a.m. every single night, you think you've seen everything the city has to offer. Drunk college students, exhausted hospital workers, security guards heading home after long shifts. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I encountered on car number 847. My name is Marcus, and I had just started a new job as a night security coordinator for a downtown office complex. The pay was decent, and honestly, after months of unemployment, I wasn't in a position to be picky about the hours. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., which meant I was catching the Red Line home at around 2:15 every morning. The routine was simple. Walk 3 blocks from the office to the State Street station, catch the northbound train, ride it for 12 stops, and walk the final 4 blocks to my apartment in Lincoln Park. For the first few weeks, everything was completely normal. Sure, the late-night crowd was different from the daytime commuters. There were fewer people, and those who were riding the train at that hour usually kept to themselves. Night shift workers have a certain understanding. We're all tired. We all just want to get home, and we don't need to make small talk with strangers. The unspoken rule was simple. Mind your own business, wear headphones, and try not to make eye contact with anyone who might be having a rough night. Hit that like button if you can relate to those late-night commutes, because what I'm about to tell you will make you think twice about every passenger you've ever ignored on public transportation. The Red Line trains in Chicago are old, dating back decades, and they have that particular smell that every subway rider knows. A mixture of metal, rubber, cleaning chemicals, and something indefinable that just screams public transportation. The seats are that industrial-grade fabric that's designed to hide stains, and the fluorescent lighting gives everyone a slightly sickly appearance. During the day, these trains are packed with commuters, tourists, and students. But at 2 a.m., you might find yourself in a car with only 3 or 4 other people, and the silence can be almost oppressive. I had settled into a comfortable routine. I would board the train at State Street, usually choosing a seat about halfway back in whatever car had the fewest people. I'd put in my earbuds, pull up a podcast or some music, and zone out for the 20-minute ride home. The train would make its stops: Monroe, Jackson, Harrison, Roosevelt, and I'd watch the occasional passenger get on or off without paying much attention. It was mindless, repetitive, and honestly, kind of soothing after spending 8 hours walking around empty office buildings and monitoring security cameras. But on October 15th, something was different from the moment I stepped onto the platform at State Street. The air felt heavier, more oppressive than usual. There was a strange electrical smell, like the moment before a thunderstorm, but the weather was clear that night. I remember checking my phone and seeing that it was exactly 2:17 a.m., 3 minutes later than my usual departure time, because I'd had to deal with a minor incident at work involving a malfunctioning elevator alarm. The train that pulled into the station was the same model I rode every night, but as I approached the doors, I noticed something odd. Car number 847 was nearly full, which was unusual for that time of night. Most of the other cars were practically empty, but this one had passengers in almost every seat. My first thought was that maybe there had been some kind of event downtown, or perhaps a late movie had just let out. Without thinking much about it, I stepped into the crowded car and looked for an available seat. Let me know in the comments if you've ever noticed something off about your regular commute, because what I observed next should have been my first warning that this wasn't a normal night. The passengers in car 847 were eerily quiet. Not the usual tired quiet of late-night commuters, but an absolute complete silence that seemed to absorb sound rather than simply being the absence of it. No one was talking, no one was shifting in their seats, no one was checking their phones. They were all sitting perfectly still, staring straight ahead with an unnatural posture that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I found an empty seat near the back of the car and sat down, pulling out my phone to check my usual apps while trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that was starting to build in my chest. But as I glanced around the car, I started to notice details that didn't add up. The passenger sitting directly across from me was wearing a heavy winter coat, which seemed odd for October in Chicago. The weather had been mild, with temperatures in the mid-60s, More strange was the fact that the coat looked old-fashioned, like something from the 1980s, with a particular style of shoulder padding and button configuration that I hadn't seen in years. The woman 3 seats up was wearing a dress that looked like it belonged in a different decade entirely. The fabric, the cut, the pattern, everything about it screamed 1970s fashion. Her hair was styled in a way that I'd only seen in old photographs, perfectly set and sprayed into a shape that defied modern trends. But what really caught my attention was her skin. Even in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the subway car, it looked gray, almost ashen, with a waxy quality that made her appear more like a mannequin than a living person. As the train pulled away from the State Street station and began its journey north, I started to pay closer attention to my fellow passengers. The man sitting near the front was wearing a suit that looked expensive but dated, with wide lapels and a tie that was way too wide for current fashion. His briefcase was one of those hard-sided leather cases that businessmen carried in the 1960s. But what really disturbed me was his posture. He was sitting completely upright, hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead without blinking. Not once did I see him blink during the entire time I was watching him. Comment below what you think was happening here, because I was starting to realize that something was very, very wrong with this situation. The train made its first stop at Monroe, and I expected to see the usual movement of passengers getting on and off. But none of the passengers in car 847 moved. They didn't even acknowledge that the train had stopped. The doors opened, stayed open for the usual 30 seconds, and then closed again. No one got off, and no one got on. The train resumed its journey, and the passengers continued to sit in their unnatural silence, staring straight ahead like statues. At the Jackson stop, the same thing happened. The doors opened, but none of my fellow passengers showed any sign of awareness that we had reached a station. By this point, my heart was starting to race, and I was beginning to question whether I was experiencing some kind of anxiety attack or panic episode. I had never been prone to mental health issues, but the combination of working night shifts and adjusting to a new job had been stressful. Maybe I was just imagining things, seeing patterns where none existed. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The passenger sitting 2 rows ahead of me, an elderly man in a cardigan sweater, wasn't breathing. I watched him for a full minute, focusing intently on his chest and shoulders, looking for any sign of the natural rise and fall that indicates respiration. Nothing. His chest was completely still, and when I looked more closely, I realized I couldn't see any pulse point movement in his neck either. That's when I started to panic, and that's when this routine commute became the most terrifying experience of my life. The realization that the elderly man wasn't breathing hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I sat there staring at him, waiting for some sign of life, but his body remained perfectly motionless. My rational mind tried to find explanations. Maybe he was sleeping so deeply that his breathing was imperceptible. Maybe the lighting was playing tricks on my eyes. Maybe I was just overtired and paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with everyone in car 847. I decided to test my theory by observing other passengers more carefully. The woman in the vintage dress hadn't moved a muscle since I'd noticed her. Her hands were folded in her lap in exactly the same position, her head tilted at precisely the same angle, and her eyes were focused on the same spot on the wall across from her. I timed her for 3 full minutes, and she never blinked, never shifted, never showed any sign of the unconscious micro-movements that living people make even when they're trying to sit still. Share your own strange public transportation experiences in the comments, because what I was witnessing defied everything I thought I knew about the world. The train reached the Harrison stop, and again, none of my fellow passengers acknowledged the station. But this time I noticed something else that made my skin crawl. As the doors opened and the platform lights illuminated the interior of the car, I could see that several of the passengers had no reflection in the windows. The man in the vintage suit, the woman in the old-fashioned dress, the elderly man in the cardigan. When the light hit the windows at just the right angle, their reflections were either completely absent or so faint that they were barely visible. I rubbed my eyes, convinced that I was hallucinating or experiencing some kind of breakdown. But when I looked again, the lack of reflections was still there. These people were sitting in seats, taking up physical space, but they weren't reflecting light the way living humans do. It was as if they were present but not entirely solid, existing in some state between being there and not being there. My hand started shaking as I reached for my phone to check the time. It was 2:28 a.m., which meant I had been on this train for about 11 minutes. Under normal circumstances, I should have been approaching my stop in another 9 minutes. But nothing about this situation felt normal anymore. I started to wonder if I was having some kind of psychotic break, if the stress of my new job and the disruption to my sleep schedule had finally pushed me over some invisible edge into mental illness. But then the woman in the vintage dress turned her head and looked directly at me. Her movement was wrong in a way that I can't adequately describe. It wasn't the smooth, natural motion of a living person turning to look at something. Instead, her head rotated in a mechanical way, like it was being controlled by some external force. Her neck turned first, creating an unnatural angle, and then her shoulders followed, but not in the coordinated way that human movement typically works. It was as if someone was manipulating a marionette, pulling strings to create the appearance of natural motion without understanding how real bodies actually move. When her eyes met mine, I felt a cold shock run through my entire body. Her eyes were completely black, not just dark brown or deep blue, but pure black, like looking into empty sockets. There were no pupils, no irises, just an endless darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And when she looked at me, I felt a presence in my mind, as if something was trying to push its way into my thoughts. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt like someone was trying to access your mind, because this sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The mental pressure was intense and uncomfortable, like having a severe headache combined with the feeling of someone pressing their hands against your temples. I could sense that this thing, because I was starting to understand that it wasn't really a woman, was trying to read my thoughts, to understand what I was and why I could see them, when other living passengers apparently couldn't. I broke eye contact and looked around the car desperately, hoping to see some other sign of normalcy, some indication that this was all just a weird coincidence or a misunderstanding. But as I examined the other passengers more closely, I realized that they were all wrong in similar ways. The man in the suit had the same black eyes, though he wasn't looking at me. The elderly man in the cardigan had skin that looked like old parchment, dry and brittle, with dark veins visible underneath. The businessman near the front had hands that were positioned unnaturally, with fingers bent at angles that would be painful for a living person. The train reached the Roosevelt stop, and I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of staying in car 847 for the remainder of my journey, I stood up quickly and moved toward the doors. As I passed the woman who had looked at me, I felt that mental pressure intensify, as if she was trying to stop me from leaving. But I pushed through the discomfort and stepped onto the platform just as the doors began to close. From the platform, I watched car 847 as the train prepared to depart. Through the windows, I could see all of the passengers sitting in exactly the same positions they had been in throughout the journey. None of them had moved when I got up to leave. None of them had turned to watch me go, and none of them seemed to acknowledge that anything had changed. They just continued staring straight ahead with their unnatural stillness, like a collection of mannequins posed to look like subway riders. But as the train began to move, the woman in the vintage dress turned to look at me through the window. Even from the platform, I could see those black, empty eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my chest tighten with fear. She pressed her hand against the window, and I could see that her palm was completely white, drained of all blood, with long fingernails that looked more like claws than normal human nails. Hit the like button if this story is giving you chills, because what happened next made me realize that this encounter was far from over. I stood on the Roosevelt platform for several minutes after the train disappeared into the tunnel, trying to process what I had just experienced. My logical mind was working overtime to find rational explanations for everything I had seen. Maybe it was a group of method actors practicing for some kind of performance art piece. Maybe it was an elaborate prank or some kind of psychological experiment. Maybe I had fallen asleep on the train, and the whole thing had been an incredibly vivid nightmare. But deep down, I knew that none of those explanations fit what I had witnessed. The physical sensations had been too real, too intense. The mental pressure when the woman looked at me had been unlike anything I could have imagined on my own. And the lack of reflections, the unnatural movements, the complete absence of any sign of life, it all pointed to something that existed outside the boundaries of normal human experience. I caught the next northbound train, making sure to board a different car, and completed my journey home without any further incidents. The remaining passengers on that train were clearly alive. They moved naturally, checked their phones, shifted in their seats, and got on and off at various stops like normal people. The contrast between their behavior and what I had witnessed in car 847 was so stark that it confirmed my suspicions that I had encountered something supernatural. When I finally reached my apartment, I was exhausted but too wired to sleep. I spent the rest of the night researching online, looking for any information about paranormal activity on the Chicago Red Line, ghost sightings in the subway system, or reports of supernatural encounters on public transportation. What I found in those early morning hours of research would change my understanding of what I had experienced and prepare me for the encounters that were still to come. My research that night revealed a disturbing pattern of unexplained incidents on the Chicago Red Line that dated back decades. I found newspaper articles from the 1970s describing mysterious disappearances of late-night passengers, reports from the 1980s of conductors seeing people on the tracks who vanished when approached, and forum posts from as recent as last year detailing encounters with passengers who didn't seem quite human. One article from 1983 particularly caught my attention, described a subway car that had been involved in a fatal accident in 1962, killing 17 passengers when the train derailed in a tunnel between the Roosevelt and Kermack stations. According to the article, car number 847 had been completely destroyed in the accident, but the Chicago Transit Authority had rebuilt it using parts from the wreckage and put it back into service in 1965. Several conductors and maintenance workers had reported strange incidents involving that specific car over the years, but their complaints had been dismissed as superstition or stress-related hallucinations. The article mentioned that car 847 was eventually taken out of regular service in 1984 after a conductor reported seeing the same passengers riding the car night after night. Passengers who never got off at any stop and who didn't respond when spoken to. But according to more recent forum posts I found, car 847 had been quietly returned to service in 2018 as part of a fleet expansion program, despite the documented history of unusual incidents. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories like this one, because what I discovered next made me realize that my encounter was part of a much larger and more dangerous pattern. The next night, October 16th, I approached my commute with a mixture of dread and curiosity. Part of me wanted to take a different route home, maybe catch a bus or even walk the 6 miles to avoid the subway entirely. But another part of me needed to know if what I had experienced was real, if it would happen again, or if it had been some kind of one-time hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. I arrived at the State Street station at my usual time, 2:17 a.m., and waited on the platform for the northbound train. When it arrived, I carefully checked the car numbers before boarding. Car 847 was the third car from the front, and as I approached it, I could see through the windows that it was once again filled with the same unnaturally still passengers I had encountered the night before. But this time, I was prepared. I had brought a small digital camera with me, one of those compact models that works well in low-light conditions. I also had a digital voice recorder and a notebook where I planned to document everything I observed. If I was going to have another supernatural encounter, I wanted evidence. I boarded car 845 instead, positioning myself near the door that connected to car 847. Through the glass partition between the cars, I could observe the strange passengers without being in the same space with them. What I saw confirmed my worst fears about what was happening on the Red Line. The same passengers were there. The woman in the vintage dress, the man in the old-fashioned suit, the elderly man in the cardigan, and about a dozen others. They were sitting in exactly the same seats they had occupied the night before, in precisely the same positions, wearing the exact same clothes. It was as if time had stopped for them at some specific moment, trapping them in an eternal loop of riding the subway without ever reaching their destination. But tonight, I noticed details that I had missed during my panicked observations the previous evening. Several of the passengers had visible injuries that they were trying to conceal. The businessman near the front had what looked like blood on his collar, dark stains that should have been obvious but somehow seemed to fade in and out of visibility, depending on the angle of the light. The woman in the vintage dress had bruises on her arms that appeared and disappeared like shadows. sometimes clearly visible, and sometimes completely absent. Let me know if you want me to investigate this further, because what I observed next suggested that these weren't just random spirits, but victims of something specific and violent. As the train moved through the tunnel system, I started taking photographs through the glass partition. Most of the images came out completely black, as if the camera couldn't detect the passengers at all. But occasionally, I would capture something, a faint outline, a blurry suggestion of a human shape, or sometimes just empty seats where I could clearly see passengers with my naked eyes. The voice recorder was picking up sounds that I couldn't hear in real time. When I played back the recordings later, there were whispers in languages I couldn't identify, what sounded like crying or moaning, and occasionally, clear words in English that sent chills down my spine. "Help us," I heard one voice say. "We can't get off," said another. "Make it stop," pleaded a third voice that sounded like it belonged to a young child. At the Harrison stop, something new happened that escalated the situation beyond anything I had experienced the night before. As the doors opened, one of the passengers in car 847 stood up and began walking toward the partition that separated our cars. It was the elderly man in the cardigan, and as he approached the glass, I could see that his movements were becoming more natural, more lifelike, as if my presence was somehow giving him strength or substance. He pressed his hands against the glass partition and looked directly at me through the window. His eyes were no longer completely black. I could see pupils and irises now, though they were surrounded by an unnatural white that looked like cataracts or severe eye damage. His mouth moved as if he was trying to speak, and I could hear faint tapping sounds as he knocked on the glass with his knuckles. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any supernatural content, because this direct contact changed everything about my understanding of what these entities wanted from me. I pulled out my notebook and held it up to the glass, hoping that he could communicate by pointing to letters or numbers. But instead of trying to spell out a message, he began tracing symbols on the glass with his finger. The symbols were complex, resembling a combination of letters, numbers, and geometric shapes that seemed to shift and change even as I was looking at them. I tried to copy the symbols into my notebook, but every time I looked down to write and then looked back up, the pattern had changed. It was as if the symbols existed in a state of constant flux, never maintaining the same configuration for more than a few seconds. But I had the distinct impression that he was trying to give me information, trying to warn me about something, or explain what had happened to him and the other passengers. As the train approached the Roosevelt stop where I had gotten off the night before, the elderly man became more agitated. His knocking on the glass became more urgent, and his mouth was moving rapidly as if he was trying to shout something that I couldn't hear. Other passengers in car 847 began to turn and look in our direction, and I could see that they were all showing signs of distress or fear. The woman in the vintage dress stood up and began walking toward the partition as well, and as she got closer, I could see that she was crying, but instead of normal tears, dark liquid was streaming down her face, leaving black stains on her cheeks that looked like old blood or ink. She pressed her hand against the glass next to the elderly man's hands, and I could see that her fingernails were indeed more like claws, long and sharp and yellowed with age. Comment below what you think was really happening here, because the train was approaching my stop, and I had to make a decision that would determine whether I learned the truth about these passengers or remained safely ignorant of whatever force was trapping them in this supernatural limbo. As the train began to slow down for the Roosevelt stop, more passengers in car 847 stood up and began moving toward the partition. They were all looking at me with expressions of desperate hope, as if I represented their only chance for salvation or escape from whatever was keeping them trapped on this endless subway ride. But I also noticed that car 847 was getting darker, as if the lighting inside was beginning to fail. The fluorescent bulbs were flickering, and shadows were gathering in the corners that seemed too deep and too dark for the small space of a subway car. And in those shadows I could see movement, shapes that were larger and more threatening than the passengers, entities that seemed to be feeding off their presence or controlling them in some way. I realized that getting off at Roosevelt again would be the safe choice, the smart choice, but it would also mean abandoning these trapped souls to whatever force was holding them prisoner. As the train came to a complete stop and the doors opened, I had to decide whether to flee to safety or stay and try to help them. knowing that doing so might trap me in the same supernatural prison that held them. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I stayed on the train as the doors closed at Roosevelt Station. The moment the train began moving again, I felt the atmosphere change dramatically. The air became thick and oppressive, like trying to breathe underwater, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air of car 845. The passengers in car 847 had all turned to face me now, pressing themselves against the glass partition that separated our cars. Their faces were no longer showing hope or desperation. Instead, they looked terrified, as if my decision to stay had triggered something they feared more than their eternal imprisonment. The elderly man was shaking his head violently, mouthing the word no over and over again, while the woman in the vintage dress was pointing frantically toward the doors, urging me to get off at the next stop, but it was too late. As the train entered the tunnel between Roosevelt and Kermack, the lights in both cars began flickering more violently, and I heard a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the walls of the tunnel itself, as if something massive and predatory was awakening in the darkness surrounding us. Share this video with someone who loves horror stories, because what emerged from the shadows of car 847 was beyond anything I could have imagined in my worst nightmares. The shadows I had noticed gathering in the corners of car 847 began to move and coalesce, forming into a shape that was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in every conceivable way. It was tall, at least 8 feet in height, with limbs that were too long and joints that bent in directions that defied human anatomy. Its skin appeared to be made of the same darkness as the shadows, a black so complete that it seemed to absorb light from the flickering fluorescent bulbs. But the most terrifying aspect of this entity was its face, or what passed for a face. Where features should have been, there was only a void punctuated by 2 points of red light that served as eyes. When it opened what might have been a mouth, I could see row after row of needle-sharp teeth that seemed to extend infinitely back into its throat, and the growling sound intensified until it was so loud that the windows of both cars began to vibrate. The trapped passengers cowered in their seats as this shadow entity moved among them, and I realized with horror that it was feeding on them somehow. As it passed each passenger, they became more translucent, more faded, as if their very essence was being drained away. The entity was a parasite, keeping them trapped in this liminal space between life and death, so that it could slowly consume whatever remained of their souls. And now that I had stayed on the train, now that I had made myself part of this supernatural prison, the entity had turned its attention to me. The glass partition between the cars began to crack under some invisible pressure, spider web fractures spreading across its surface as the entity pressed against it from the other side. I could feel that same mental pressure I had experienced when the woman looked at me, but magnified 100-fold. It was as if someone was driving spikes into my brain, trying to break down the barriers of my consciousness and take control of my mind. Let me know in the comments what you think I should have done next, because the train was still moving through the tunnel, and I was trapped with this thing until we reached the next station. I tried to move toward the doors at the end of car 845, hoping to escape into another car, but my legs wouldn't obey my commands. The entity's mental influence was spreading through my body, paralyzing me from the feet up. I could feel my muscles becoming rigid and unresponsive, just like the trapped passengers who sat motionless in their seats night after night. But then something unexpected happened. The elderly man in the cardigan, the same passenger who had tried to communicate with me through the glass, suddenly stood up and turned to face the shadow entity. His movements were different now. Instead of the mechanical, puppet-like motion I had observed before, he moved with purpose and determination. The dark tears that had been streaming down his face began to glow with a faint white light, and when he spoke, I could hear his voice clearly, despite the glass barrier between us. "You cannot have this one," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had once been alive and strong and brave. "This one still breathes. This one still chooses. You can only take those who have already surrendered to death." The shadow entity turned away from me and focused its attention on the elderly man, its red eyes blazing with rage. But as it approached him, something remarkable happened. The other passengers began to stand as well, one by one, and I could see that same faint light beginning to emanate from their eyes and mouths. They were fighting back, using whatever remained of their life force to protect me from sharing their fate. The woman in the vintage dress stepped forward and joined her voice to the elderly man's. "We have been your prisoners long enough," she said. "We will not let you claim another innocent soul." The businessman near the front, the young woman with the old-fashioned hairstyle, the man in the winter coat, they all began to advance on the shadow entity, surrounding it with their fading but determined spirits. Hit that like button if this supernatural battle is giving you chills, because what happened next proved that even in death, the human spirit can choose to fight for what's right. The battle between the trapped passengers and the shadow entity was unlike anything I could have imagined. It wasn't a physical confrontation. Instead, it was a clash of wills, a struggle between the entity's hunger for souls and the passengers' determination to protect an innocent life. The air in both cars crackled with supernatural energy, and I could see streams of light flowing back and forth between the combatants like visible manifestations of their spiritual strength. The shadow entity grew larger and more menacing as it fed on the passengers' energy, but they continued to resist, drawing on reserves of courage and compassion that death itself couldn't extinguish. The elderly man reached out and grabbed the entity's arm, and where his hand made contact, the darkness began to burn away, revealing something pale and sickly underneath. "We remember who we were," the woman in the vintage dress declared, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "We remember our lives, our loves, our hopes. You cannot erase that. You cannot make us forget that we were human." The train began to slow as we approached the Cermak station, and I realized that this supernatural battle had to end before we reached the platform. If the doors opened while the entity was still active, it might escape into the subway system and find new victims to torment. As the passengers continued their assault on the shadow entity, I felt the paralysis leaving my body. My legs began to respond to my commands again, and the crushing mental pressure began to ease. The entity was losing its hold on me, as more and more of its energy was diverted to fighting off the rebellious souls it had kept trapped for so long. But I also realized that the passengers were growing weaker with each passing second. Their bodies were becoming more translucent, their voices fainter as they expended the last of their spiritual energy in this final act of defiance. They were sacrificing whatever remained of their existence to save me, and I knew that once this battle was over, they would finally be able to pass on to whatever comes after death. The shadow entity made one last, desperate attempt to break free from the passengers' collective will. It expanded to fill. The shadow entity made one last, desperate attempt to break free from the passengers' collective will. It expanded to fill almost the entire car 847, its tendrils of darkness reaching in every direction, trying to engulf the rebellious spirits who had dared to defy it. But the passengers held their formation, creating a circle of light around the creature that grew brighter with each passing second. The elderly man in the cardigan reached his hand toward me through the cracked glass partition, and though I couldn't touch him physically, I felt a spiritual connection form between us. "You must bear witness," he said, his voice echoing directly in my mind. "You must tell the world what happened to us, so that others don't suffer the same fate." Through this connection, images flooded my consciousness, memories of the passengers' former lives, of how they died, of how they became trapped in this supernatural limbo. I saw the 1962 train accident, the bloodshed, the panic, and then the darkness that engulfed them. I saw how the shadow entity had fed on their fear and despair, keeping them imprisoned between life and death to sustain its insatiable hunger for spiritual energy. But I also saw their courage, their refusal to surrender completely, and their determination to protect the innocent even in death. They had waited decades for someone like me, someone who could see them and potentially help them break their supernatural chains. The train began to slow as we approached Cermak station, and the spiritual battle reached its crescendo. The shadow entity let out a deafening roar that shattered the windows of both cars, raining glass down on the empty seats. But as it screamed, it also began to fragment, pieces of its shadowy form being torn away by the determined passenger's light. "Now!" shouted the woman in the vintage dress, her voice carrying an authority that transcended death. "While it's weakened, we must break the bond that keeps us tethered to this place." The passengers joined together, their ghostly forms merging into a single entity of pure light that completely enveloped the shadow creature. For a moment, The entire car 847 was flooded with a blinding luminosity that forced me to cover my eyes. When the light faded, the shadow entity was gone, leaving only small wisps of dark smoke that quickly dissipated in the frigid air. Subscribe to the channel if this supernatural battle is giving you chills, because what happened next proved that even in death, human goodness can triumph over evil. The passengers turned to look at me one final time, and I could see that their appearances had changed. They no longer looked like walking corpses or marionettes controlled by supernatural forces. Instead, they looked like real people again, with color in their cheeks and life in their eyes. The elderly man smiled at me with an expression of profound gratitude. "Thank you," he said, "for giving us the courage to fight back, for reminding us who we were before we became prisoners." The woman in the vintage dress waved, and I could see tears of joy. Not the dark tears of despair I had noticed before, but clear, clean tears of relief and liberation. One by one, the passengers began to disappear, their forms dissolving into particles of golden light that floated through the car like fireflies. They were finally free to move on to whatever comes after death, released from the supernatural prison that had held them captive for more than 6 decades. The train arrived at Kermak station, and the doors opened with the familiar sound of the automated announcement. I stumbled out of car 845, my legs barely supporting me after the intense experience I had just lived through. When I turned to look at car 847 one last time, it was completely empty, just vacant seats illuminated by normal fluorescent lighting. But on the window glass, someone had written a message in what appeared to be condensation. "Thank you for setting us free. The passengers of 1962. As I watched, the words slowly faded away, leaving only a clean, clear glass surface. Leave a comment if you believe spirits can find peace after death, because my journey with the ghost passengers was just beginning to show its lasting effects. I stood on the Cermak platform for nearly 20 minutes, trying to process what I had witnessed. The supernatural battle, the liberation of trapped souls, and my role in freeing them from decades of torment. It all felt simultaneously real and impossible. But the physical evidence was undeniable. The shattered windows, the lingering cold in the air, and the profound sense of peace that had settled over car 847. As I finally made my way home, using a different route to avoid any chance of encountering residual supernatural activity, I realized that my life had been fundamentally changed by this experience. I had seen beyond the veil between life and death, witnessed the power of human compassion to overcome evil, and played a crucial role in one of the most significant paranormal events in Chicago's history. But I also understood that this encounter had marked me in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. The shadow entity was gone, destroyed by the collective will of its former victims, but the spiritual sensitivity that had allowed me to see the trapped passengers wasn't going away. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger, opening my perception to supernatural phenomena that had always existed just beyond the awareness of most people. Hit that like button if you've ever felt like a supernatural encounter changed you permanently, because what I experienced in the following weeks would confirm that some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed again. In the days following my encounter with the ghost passengers of car 847, my life changed in ways I could never have predicted. The most immediate effect was my completely altered relationship with the Chicago subway system, where once I had seen only a practical means of transportation, I now saw a complex labyrinth of underground tunnels that could harbor any manner of supernatural phenomena. Every time I entered a subway station, my senses became hyper-alert. I found myself scrutinizing every passenger, looking for signs of the same supernatural indicators I had learned to recognize: the unnatural stillness, the lack of reflections, the absence of visible breathing. Fortunately, in the weeks following the incident, every passenger I encountered seemed gloriously, reassuringly alive, but the experience had awakened something in me, a sensitivity to the paranormal that I had never possessed before. I began noticing things that other commuters ignored: shadows that moved independently of their sources, whispers that seemed to come from the tunnel walls, and occasionally, indistinct figures standing on platforms who would vanish when I tried to focus on them directly. Hit that notification bell if you've ever noticed strange things that others seem unable to see, because I discovered that once you open your mind to the supernatural, it's impossible to close it completely again. I returned to my online research with renewed vigor, now armed with first-hand knowledge of what was possible in the realm of supernatural encounters. I found an online community of people who had experienced similar phenomena in public transportation systems around the world. There were reports of ghost trains in London, spectral passengers on the Tokyo subway, and apparitions in metro systems from New York to Moscow. What struck me about these stories was the consistency of certain details. Many of the people reporting supernatural encounters mentioned the same sensation of mental pressure I had experienced, the same unnatural quality of the spirit's movements, and the same impression that these entities were trapped in some kind of temporal loop. More importantly, I discovered that my experience with Car 847 wasn't an isolated incident. Other forum users reported sightings of ghost passengers on the Chicago Red Line dating back to the early 2000s, when Car 847 had been quietly returned to service. Most of these reports had been dismissed as urban legends or the products of overactive imaginations, but reading them now, I could see the truth in every detail. One forum user, posting under the username Midnight Commuter, had described an encounter almost identical to mine in January 2019. They had noticed the same unnaturally still passengers, the same lack of reflections in the windows, and the same sense of being mentally probed by entities that existed in a space between life and death. But unlike me, they had fled at the first opportunity and never returned to investigate further. Another user, TrainSpotter22, had posted a series of blurry photographs taken through the windows of Car 847 over several months in 2020. In most of the images, the car appeared empty despite clear descriptions of seeing passengers with the naked eye. But in a few photos, there were faint translucent figures visible in the seats, confirming that these entities existed in a state that made them difficult to capture with conventional technology. Share your own supernatural public transportation experiences in the comments, because what I learned from this research community changed my understanding of the entire incident and its broader implications. The most disturbing discovery I made was a pattern of disappearances connected to the Red Line that had been occurring sporadically since Car 847 was returned to service. Every few months, a late-night commuter would simply vanish without a trace, last seen boarding a Red Line train that would arrive at its destination, missing a passenger who had been witnessed getting on. The Chicago Transit Authority had no official explanation for these disappearances, attributing them to people getting off at intermediate stops or choosing alternative routes home. But the forum community had been tracking these cases, and the pattern was unmistakable. All of the missing passengers had been riding the Red Line between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. All had been traveling alone, and all had last been seen in the vicinity of Car 847. I realized with growing horror that if I hadn't escaped from Car 847 on that first night, if I had stayed until the end of the line, I might have become another missing person statistic. The shadow entity that had been feeding on the trapped passengers was also actively hunting for new victims, people who could see through its disguise and who might therefore pose a threat to its continued existence. This knowledge filled me with a sense of responsibility that I struggled to process. I had witnessed the liberation of 17 souls who had been trapped in supernatural limbo for more than 60 years. But I had also inadvertently exposed myself to a predatory entity that specifically targeted people with supernatural sensitivity. Every time I rode the subway now, I was potentially putting myself at risk of another encounter. Let me know in the comments what you think I should have done with this information, because the decision I made next would have consequences that extended far beyond my own safety. I decided to go public with my story, despite knowing that most people would dismiss it as fiction or the product of mental illness. I started with the online forum community, sharing my detailed account of the encounter and the evidence I had gathered. The response was overwhelmingly supportive, with dozens of users sharing their own experiences and thanking me for having the courage to tell the complete story. But I didn't stop there. I contacted local journalists, paranormal investigators, and even reached out to the Chicago Transit Authority with my findings. Most of these attempts were ignored or politely dismissed, but a few people took my account seriously enough to investigate further. A paranormal research team from Northwestern University agreed to conduct an overnight investigation of Car 847, equipped with electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and digital voice recorders. I served as their guide, helping them identify the specific times and locations where supernatural activity was most likely to occur. The results of their investigation were inconclusive from a scientific standpoint, but personally validating for me. Their equipment detected unexplained electromagnetic fluctuations in car 847 between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., recorded audio anomalies that sounded like human voices speaking in distress, and captured thermal imagery showing cold spots in the exact locations where I had observed the ghostly passengers. More importantly, the lead investigator, Dr. Sarah Chen, experienced some of the same sensations I had described: the feeling of being mentally probed, the sense of invisible presences in the car, and the overwhelming impression that they were not alone despite the car appearing empty to casual observation. Comment below if you think scientific validation is important for supernatural experiences, because Dr. Chen's investigation led to discoveries that would vindicate my account and potentially save other people from experiencing what I had gone through. Dr. Chen's team was able to access historical records about car 847 that had not been available to me during my initial research. They discovered that the car had indeed been involved in the fatal 1962 derailment, and that it had been rebuilt, using not just parts from the wreckage, but also materials salvaged from the tunnel where the accident occurred. More disturbing was their discovery that the section of tunnel between Roosevelt and Cermak stations had been the site of multiple accidents and incidents over the decades, creating what Dr. Chen described as a supernatural hotspot, where the barrier between the world of the living and the dead had been worn thin by repeated trauma. The investigation team also found evidence that the Chicago Transit Authority had been aware of the supernatural activity associated with car 847 for years, but had chosen to keep the car in service, rather than deal with the expense and publicity of retiring it permanently. Internal memos obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests showed that CTA officials had received dozens of reports about strange occurrences in car 847, but had consistently dismissed them as coincidence or imagination. Armed with this evidence, Dr. Chen and I presented our findings to the CTA Board of Directors in a closed session. While they wouldn't acknowledge the supernatural aspects of our investigation publicly, they agreed to quietly retire car 847 from active service and seal off the section of tunnel where the most intense paranormal activity had been recorded. The decision to remove car 847 from service was announced as a routine maintenance procedure, but those of us who knew the truth understood its real significance. The supernatural prison that had held 17 souls captive for more than 60 years was finally being dismantled, ensuring that no other late-night commuters would fall victim to the predatory entity that had fed on their fear and despair. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that sometimes the right thing to do requires courage in the face of skepticism, because the final chapter of this story proves that even the most extraordinary experiences can have lasting, positive impacts on the world. In the months that followed, the pattern of mysterious disappearances on the Red Line came to an abrupt end. No more late-night commuters vanished without explanation. No more families were left wondering what had happened to their loved ones who had simply never made it home from work. The supernatural threat that had lurked in the depths of Chicago's subway system for decades was finally eliminated. My own life settled into a new normal, though one forever changed by my encounter with the supernatural. I continued working the night shift, but I found myself approaching my job with a renewed sense of purpose. I had learned that there were forces in the world beyond human understanding, and that sometimes ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things. The paranormal sensitivity that had been awakened by my encounter with the ghost passengers never faded, but I learned to see it as a gift rather than a burden. I began volunteering with local paranormal investigation groups, using my abilities to help other people who had experienced supernatural encounters and needed someone who would believe their stories. Most importantly, I never forgot the lesson taught to me by the passengers of car 847, that human compassion and courage can overcome even the darkest supernatural forces. The 17 souls who sacrificed themselves to save me from sharing their fate had shown me that death doesn't end our capacity for heroism, and that sometimes the greatest acts of bravery come from those who have already lost everything. Their sacrifice ensured that car 847 would never claim another victim, and their memory serves as a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we always have the power to choose hope over despair, courage over fear, and love over hatred. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think differently about the supernatural encounters that happen all around us every day, then please share it with others who might need to hear it. Because the truth is, we're all just passengers on this journey through life. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is help a fellow traveler find their way home. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for believing. And remember, the next time you're on public transportation late at night, take a moment to really look at your fellow passengers. You never know who might need your help to finally find peace. 1 year later, the Chicago Tribune ran a small article buried on page 7 of the Metro section. CTA retires historic red line car after mechanical issues. Most readers skipped past it, unaware that Car 847's retirement marked the end of one of the city's most persistent supernatural mysteries. I kept that newspaper clipping in my wallet, a tangible reminder of how the extraordinary can be disguised as the mundane. The article mentioned nothing about ghost passengers, shadow entities, or souls trapped between worlds. To the general public, it was simply the routine replacement of aging transit equipment. But I knew better, and so did the families of those 17 passengers who had finally found peace after 60 years of supernatural imprisonment. Dr. Chen's paranormal research team expanded their work, investigating other locations throughout Chicago, where tragic events had created similar supernatural hotspots. Our success with Car 847 had proven that these phenomena could be documented, understood, and ultimately resolved. We discovered that Chicago's extensive public transportation network, built over more than a century of urban development, contained dozens of locations where the veil between life and death had worn thin. Most were harmless, brief glimpses of people from another time, echoes of conversations long past, but a few posed genuine dangers to living passengers. I became their unofficial guide to the supernatural underground, helping identify locations where sensitive individuals might encounter more than they bargained for during their daily commute. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. Every confirmed haunting we investigated and resolved meant fewer people would experience the terror I had faced that November night. Perhaps the most surprising development came 6 months after Car 847's retirement. I received a handwritten letter at my workplace, something increasingly rare in our digital age. The return address showed no name, just a post office box in Oak Park. Inside, I found a faded photograph from 1962 showing 17 people standing together on what appeared to be a train platform. They were smiling, dressed in their work clothes, clearly heading home after a long day. I recognized every face. The letter was brief. Dear friend, we wanted you to have this picture taken just hours before our accident. We were real people once with real lives and families we loved. Thank you for helping us remember who we were before we became prisoners. We are at peace now. The passengers. I had the photograph professionally preserved and framed. It sits on my desk at home, a reminder that every ghost story begins with real people who deserved better than to be forgotten. My experience with the supernatural had fundamentally changed my relationship with the city I called home. Chicago was no longer just a place I lived and worked. It had become a vast repository of untold stories, both beautiful and tragic, that existed just beyond the perception of most residents. I began documenting these stories, not for YouTube views or social media engagement, but as a historical record for future generations. Someone needed to bear witness to the supernatural heritage woven into the fabric of our urban landscape. The Chicago Public Library agreed to archive my research, creating a special collection for paranormal historical accounts. Other cities began requesting similar documentation, recognizing that supernatural phenomena were part of their cultural legacy, deserving of preservation and study rather than dismissal and ridicule. Word of our successful intervention with Car 847 spread through online paranormal communities worldwide. I began receiving messages from people who had experienced similar encounters in subway systems across the globe. London's Underground, Tokyo's Metro, New York's subway network. Each story followed familiar patterns. Public transportation systems built over sites of historical trauma, creating supernatural hotspots. where trapped souls waited for someone brave enough to help them find peace. Our methodology for investigation and resolution became a template for paranormal researchers in other cities. More importantly, fewer people were disappearing from late-night trains. The predatory entities that fed on human fear seemed to lose their power when exposed to organized investigation and community awareness. Knowledge, it turned out, was our most effective weapon against supernatural threats. Final reflections. As I write this final account, exactly 1 year after my encounter with the ghost passengers, I'm sitting in the same coffee shop where I first researched Car 847's history. The irony isn't lost on me. I'm now the person creating the internet content that future supernatural investigators will discover when they encounter their own paranormal mysteries. The barista who serves my usual order has no idea that the quiet customer in the corner booth has helped liberate 17 trapped souls, documented dozens of supernatural encounters, and contributed to the early retirement of a haunted subway car. To her, I'm just another night shift worker grabbing coffee before heading home. That anonymity suits me perfectly. The real heroes of this story were the 17 passengers who chose courage over despair in their darkest hour. They taught me that death doesn't end our capacity for growth, sacrifice, or love. They showed me that even when stripped of everything we consider essential to human existence, we retain the power to choose hope. If you're reading this account because you've encountered something unexplainable during your own late-night travels, remember these key lessons. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. The supernatural often announces itself through subtle wrongness before revealing its true nature. You're not crazy, and you're not alone. Thousands of people worldwide have experiences similar to yours. The paranormal investigation community is ready to help. Supernatural entities draw power from fear and isolation. The moment you share your experience with others, you begin to diminish their influence over you. Most importantly, remember that you have the power to help. The ghost passengers of Car 847 waited 60 years for someone with the courage and compassion to see their suffering and take action. Your encounter might be the key to helping other trapped souls find peace. The end, or perhaps the beginning. Car 847 now sits in a CTA maintenance facility on the south side, permanently retired from passenger service. Dr. Chen's team continues to monitor it with remote sensors, confirming that all supernatural activity has ceased. The car itself has become just another piece of decommissioned transit equipment, remarkable only for its age and the memories it holds. But sometimes, late at night when I'm walking home from work, I catch glimpses of familiar figures at bus stops and train platforms throughout the city. They're not trapped anymore. These are just brief visits from souls who wanted to check on the world they once knew. They never approach me directly, but I sense their gratitude in the way shadows fall more gently, in the way cold winds carry hints of warmth, in the way empty spaces feel just a little less lonely. The ghost passengers of Car 847 taught me that some stories never truly end. They simply transform into something new. Their tragedy became triumph, their imprisonment became liberation, and their despair became hope for others facing similar darkness. And in the depths of Chicago's sprawling transit system, late-night commuters travel a little safer, protected by the sacrifice of 17 souls who refuse to let evil claim another victim. The L train rumbles through the night, carrying its cargo of dreams and stories, both seen and unseen. In the space between stations, between heartbeats, between one moment and the next, the extraordinary waits patiently for those brave enough to witness it. Some passengers never reach their final destination. Others discover that the journey itself was always the point. The choice, as always, is yours.